Hello, everybody, and welcome back. It is good to talk to all of you again, and today I want to talk about carriers again. So, before I really get to the video, I just want to preface the video by saying a few things, which is one, I don't really want carriers to be overpowered, nor do I want surface ships to be overpowered against carriers. That's not the goal. What I fundamentally want is only one thing, and I want to see a fun gameplay experience for both parties. And the reason I say this is because during the course of the CV rework and the AA rework, I've seen a lot of my friends who used to play this game who've just thrown up their hands and have outright quit. And the reason for them quitting is pretty much universally the same. The interaction is just not fun, and the experience is not fun, right? You could be having fun on one side. If you were, let's say, the carry player, maybe you're having fun, but the surface ship player isn't. Or if maybe you happen to be the surface ship player and you're really enjoying it, maybe the carrier player isn't having fun, right? So fundamentally what I want is a good, fun gameplay experience for both parties. Now, by this day and age, it is pretty clear that wargaming is pretty much holding firm to the core ideas of the CV rework, right? So I'm not going to try to, I guess, change the core, right? So the way that you currently play in terms of flying the aircraft, all that will still stay the same. But perhaps there are some changes that can still be made to make the experience fun for both sides. See, what I've been doing is contemplating the surface ship CV interaction. And fundamentally, what I think is wrong with the surface ship carrier interaction is that you have a PvP game, right, where there isn't really actual any sort of PvP interaction. And because there's really not that interaction, it's not really all that fun. So here are what I think are essentially the four major problems from my perspective. And the first one is that carriers don't fight other carriers at all. It's essentially a damage race between the two carriers. They just do that every single game. It's just I damage race the other CV, and whoever ends up doing more has a higher chance of winning. One might argue that the old CVs require too much skill, right? And that the bad CV players got stomped on too hard, and there needed to be a reduction in skill gap, and that's why we have the rework. And I'm okay with that. I accept that argument, but does the solution to that particular problem involve just completely removing CV versus CV counterplay interaction? So, I mean, two CV players get in the match, and they're not playing a PvP game against each other at all. They're playing a damage race game with themselves. Essentially, it's not really great from a PvP game perspective when you're essentially able to just ignore the other ship, right? And furthermore, now that we've had the CV rework for a while and we've sort of seen the results, it's pretty clear that the bad players are still bad. So, has the issue really been solved? I'm not 100% sure, right? Okay, so that's really the first major problem, is that there is just no PvP interaction between the two carriers. Or the four carriers, depending if we have 4 CV matchmaking, but hopefully it'll just become 2 in the future. Okay, so the second problem is surface ships in carrier games. They also don't really have counterplay aside from maneuvering their ship and setting the one, reinforced sector. That's it, right? As a surface ship player, when a CV decides to come after you, you mostly pray to whichever god you have that the following happens, which is 1, your sustained DPS is strong enough to bring down enemy planes. The enemy CV is terrible enough to run into your flat clouds and lose their planes, or the CV player really screws up on a drop. Oh, that, or you pray that you have a friendly ship right next to you that has sufficient continuous DPS to bring down planes. So really, that's what you're praying for. And aside from that, like I said, you don't really have much interaction there, right? Now, you might argue that the sector reinforcement is the interaction, but I'd argue that that particular aspect of gameplay, it's clunky as all hell. The interface is clunky. It doesn't really flow with the game at all, and not really fun for the surface ship player at all. And furthermore, there's the issue of, the nearly constantly being under attack, the sort of very quick squadron, downtimes where it's like you just got attacked and here comes another squadron, right? Like, that's not fun. And especially if you just happen to be like a lower tier ship with a CV, a higher tier CV in the game, it's not a fun interaction. So surfer ship's not having a great day either. Okay, now looking at it from the other perspective, so if you're a carrier and you're running into a surfer ship interaction, well, it's also not really fun. I guess, there's maybe exceptions, but in most cases, not the best experience either. I mean, you line up your strike, you drop your weapons, you land the hits, and your damage isn't exactly amazing. So it's not like you're hitting something that you've really set up and you've got it and you're like, yeah, look at that, that's amazing. It's not really happening. So you don't really have that burst of euphoria for having done it. And then as soon as that strike is done, you basically grab another squadron and you rinse repeat, all 4 chunks of damage that really doesn't, I guess, release that dopamine in your brain. It doesn't make you go, hell yeah, that was amazing, right? There isn't really that feeling. So the feeling of reward as a CV player, probably not that great either. Furthermore, you still have the issue where, the enemy's AA hitting your planes, knocking your planes out of the sky is at times kind of random. At times it's fine, at times it's just super random, and that is also a bit of a sort of a kind of a crappy interaction as well, right? Because there's no predictability again. So that's the first 3 points. And fourth, and this is more of a specific ship class point, is the very specific issues faced by destroyers and ships that are supposed to be flankers. With a CV, these ships, they suffer tremendously. DD suffer in this environment because, well, their AA doesn't really do that much, and rocket planes come in and hit you for damage, and like, what are you going to do, right? And plus, that rocket plane attack can just be done repeatedly, once, twice, 3 times, right? And then you get hit by dive bombers, and then you're pretty much out of the game. If you are a flanker, which, in the past that used to be a role, you get on the flanks, you provide that crossfire, you provide that annoyance on the flank, well, now you just become the ideal CV target, and once again, problem with the AA comes up again. Your AA might just do nothing, and then you just become food. So both of these 2 ship classes, they suffer. So in my sort of take on carriers and surface ships from both perspectives, I think these are the major issues. And you might say that the statistics and the numbers look fine, but it doesn't change the gameplay experience for not being very good. Okay, so now this is our issue, right? These are the fundamental problems. Is there a way to resolve these issues without doing something drastic like a implementation of a full manual skill-based AA and things like that, which is something I advocated for before, and I know it's not happening, right? Wargaming has pretty much, I think, 100% ruled that out, that is not happening. So we're going to have to stick with pretty much what we have most of the way. All right, so can we, within the confines of the system, create a system that is easy enough to understand, easy enough to use, kind of is smooth within the gameplay, and it provides just that sufficient amount of player versus player interaction, right? So that both sides feel like they're playing a PvP game, and then there is play, counterplay, and counterplay, right? And I think there is, and I don't think some of the things are maybe as complicated as they would seem. So here's my suggestions. Okay, so the first suggestion, I think, is we need better implementations of the fighters that you can call in. Now, these current fighters that you call into the game right now, they're not all that useful. In fact, they're sort of more useful as a vision ward than really, actually shooting down enemy aircraft. So what we do is we change that rule, right? First of all, we don't allow them to provide spotting. So this should help destroyers as well in terms of their concealment, right? Nobody can just fly over there, drop a plane on you, and too bad. So get rid of the spotting ability of the fighters, right? But what the fighters can do is that they can spot aircraft. And what they have is faster reactions, faster intercept times, and a bigger sort of radius that allows them to intercept things. So what now you have to do with these fighters is you have to consider zoning. It's kind of a defensive play for your team, right? You really have to look at where your team might need help, where your team might end up. So you go over there, you drop that fighter ward, and ships who are on your team who are going to need that support from your fighters can go and seek it out if you drop it in the right way. So there's a little bit of counterplay now between 2 CV players, right? CV players now can consider countering enemy CV attack aircraft, right? Like dive bombers or torpedo bombers. So that's like the first thing. So to make this consumable that much more interesting, what we should do is make it so that there's a cooldown timer for the consumable, so you can't just be calling in them all the time. But they are of pretty much near limitless use, right? There's no limits to the charge. However, this consumable is only usable by the rocket planes. Okay, so there is the limitation. Why do I think this might be an interesting implementation? Well, one, the rocket planes now have a very interesting role because they're now the only aircraft type that provides some sort of defensive play. And this brings in that carrier-on-carrier interaction again, right? So now a carrier can both play offense and defense, yeah? Second, I think the advantage of this is that now the player who's playing CV, who's playing the rocket planes, now they have to think about things maybe defensively a little bit. So because they're thinking about things defensively, maybe they're not going to be pressuring destroyers all that heavily, right? Now they're having to think, maybe I should go provide defense first, and then maybe I'll go look for that destroyer, instead of just, in the current game, you just beeline for the destroyer. And since planes are that much faster, ships can't really get away, right? Third, the rocket planes are now going to become a precious asset because you need the rocket planes, and you could even set it so that the rocket planes needs like a minimum number of planes in order to call in a squadron. Let's say you need 3 planes minimum or something like that. Well, now as a CV player, you now have to really balance it. Do you want to attack with them, potentially lose the planes, and then not be able to call down your consumable, right? And again, the actual consumable utilization is still a press of a button, so it's still simple on the surface and easy to play. But there is at least some sort of PvP interaction, some depth to it, which can make CV on CV interaction a little bit more interesting. Now, with CVs being able to provide some defensive ability, let's turn our attention to the surface ships, right? Because I said earlier, surface ship interaction with aircraft is pretty darn terrible. Because in the current interaction, you're just sitting there and praying for something to work, right? Like in this case, here's the enemy bombers coming in, I've hit DFAA, and I'm just saying, okay, I hope my continuous DPS is enough, along with the allied ship that I have here, that I'm going to be able to drop all their planes. That's it. That's all I'm hoping for, right? And for the enemy CV player, I'm not sure how much fun that was, because, you know, there's, you know, like, what are you going to do? It's continuous DPS per second. There's nothing. So can we fix this and make it so that AA becomes something a little bit more smooth, right? It's more of a seamless experience, because currently the only thing you do is sector reinforcement by pressing the tilt key, which brings up the menu, and you got to set a sector. Can we make that experience more seamless? And can we make it so that there is, again, some PvP element to it, where I can feel like I'm doing something to protect myself, and the CV player feels like there's some way for them to perhaps defend their planes as well, right? By playing it skillfully. And I think there is. Because currently in the game, we have one system where we sort of go from one weapon system to another very, very smoothly. And that happens to do with destroyers and torpedoes. And you can do that sort of switch very, very quickly, right? You can go from main guns to your torpedoes in very quick motion and then go back to your guns, right? And firing off torpedoes and everything is really, really quick. What if we can adapt that kind of system to defensive AA, right? And we can give defensive AA to all ships. It's okay, because what they're doing is no longer boosting continuous DPS, because what we're really doing is we're shifting what is lethal to aircraft, right? The plane shoot down capability. We're moving that away from the current continuous DPS, which is really no fun and no interaction, and we move it back to a system that's currently in the game, which is the flak. So what we do is that when you hit your DFAA, and again, you can have unlimited charges of this, right? And it can be on a cooldown of like 30 seconds or whatever, kind of similar to the current sector reinforcement. And what happens is the minute you hit your DFAA, you get like a cone, right? And this cone can be a narrow cone, it can be a wide cone, it can be whatever you want for the nation, the type of ship, however you want to end up balancing this particular kind of system. And then what ends up happening is that you hit the DFAA, you get this cone, and you're able to set this cone within a 360-degree circle of your ship, right? So let's say you get a circle, and you can just aim that in any which direction. Now, inside this cone, outside the cone, it'll still be maybe half flak burst, maybe it's a little bit less, maybe it's 75%. I'm not 100% sure about the numbers. If Wargaming decides to try something like this, they'll have to figure out the values as well, right? But inside the cone, what ends up happening is instead of just saying, okay, you get a 100% buff to your continuous DPS, inside the cone, you get 2 times, 3 times, maybe 4 times the flak bursts that you would normally have. So what this will create is one highly lethal zone that, if placed correctly, can really tear down planes. But the CV player can also recognize that there is danger and potentially do something about it, right? So think about how this will work, right? Because no longer, if you have a system like this, would CVs just be able to lazily bank left and right through the flak AA and then have to just deal with the continuous DPS that there's nothing they can do about it. It'll just end up shredding their planes out of the sky. This will allow pretty much all ships to have some kind of play-counterplay interaction with carriers, right? If you do it horribly wrong and you place it in the wrong place, or you're inattentive and you don't place it at all, then the CV hits you and you suffer and you die. But if you do it well, then the CV pays the price and loses a lot of their planes, right? Assuming 2 equally skilled players, what might end up happening is we kind of go back to a situation where the sort of high lethality flak comes up and it ends up creating a bit of a panic for the CV player, and the CV player has to like get out of the way of that, and maybe their strikes are no longer as accurate, right? They'll still maybe be able to get their ordnance off, but maybe it is not as accurate. So at least if we have something like that, it'll provide, 1, that interaction, and 2, it might finally give ships like the flanking ships and the destroyers some way to defend themselves, right? Some way of protecting themselves so they're not constantly getting just, crapped on, essentially. And again, it'll kind of end up dealing with a little bit of player skill, but not so much, right? It's not like here's a fully manual system that you really got to spend a lot of time on. Here's something you can hit, quickly set, and then move back to what you were doing normally. Now, assuming that both of these systems get implemented and now CVs have a bit of counterplay against each other, surface ship has better counterplay against this aircraft, then you have to also reward the carrier players for actually getting their strikes right. So if they manage to get a strike through and they manage to hit a target, then you've got to reward them. Because currently, like I said, there is none of that, yeah, I managed to get through a strike, right? You could land all 6 torpedoes, even on a midway, and you're looking at your damage and going, oh, okay. That was okay. And you just kind of have that attitude towards things. So I think that is something that also would have to be addressed. If, once we have these 2 systems, of course, then we can address them. So first things first is, okay, no more repeated strikes, right? Let's not do that anymore. And what we can do is, hey, if you get your strike through, you will get good damage. Like, you will get that better alpha damage. So the CV player who has, done all the work to dodge all the AA and finally get off the right strike, fantastic, right? You're going to get rewarded with damage that you're going to be like, whoa, sweet, that's amazing damage, right? Kind of like how a battleship gets that Citadel hit, right? So you will get that. Now, exactly how high the alpha needs to be, of course, will have to be tested by Wargaming, and they'll have to figure out, hey, do we want, they'll have to tweak it. This is something that I'm not going to have the numbers for off the top of my head, right? And so let's solve that problem. Now, I did say no more repeated attacks, so what instead you want to do, because remember, the whole getting constantly harassed is not fun, so what you do is you create timers, right? You create a prep timer and, let's say, a rearm timer, prep 2 timers. So an example of how an aircraft squadron will work, let's say I send out my rocket planes. I first have to go through a 30-second prep timer, right? So I select the squadron for launch, 30 seconds of prep, then the aircraft launch. They fly off, they do their thing, they attack whatever, and you bring them back home, right? So you fly them back to your carrier, and you select your next squadron. And the next squadron takes 30 seconds, or maybe longer, depending on the aircraft types, right? Sometimes you might want to put a slightly longer one for different aircraft types, whichever. And you launch that squadron. Now, the first squadron that comes all the way back, they land, they have to go through that initial rearm timers. Let's say that's 60 seconds. And even after they're done rearming, let's say you want to launch that squadron again, they still go through 30 more seconds of prep, like every other time. So, there'll be like a minute and a half before the same aircraft type can maybe come back after you. And even for, if it's not the same aircraft type, you'd at least get, let's say, 30, 45 seconds or whatever of time before the next wave appears. And again, all the timers, I'm just giving an example, they will have to be adjusted based on actual in-game, data and experimentation. So this will slow down the rate of strikes. This will allow surface ships now to better play their roles. if they're going to be, like let's say flanking or they're destroyer, whatever, there's more time for them to do their thing, right? There's more time for them to actually do their roles. And finally, addressing the destroyer flanking ship roles, if all these suggestions come into place, those ship classes should benefit, right? Because, for the flanking cruisers, now they have access to a defensive AA consumable that they can, set a cone and really, really kill planes if they do it right, and defend themselves from these attacks. The attacks will only be one wave, so there's no multiple attacks, right? They won't get constantly spotted. They won't have to deal with that. And plus, there's going to be a break between the attack waves. So there's going to be more time for the flankers to do their job. The same will be true for destroyers. And as for the destroyers, if let's say all these changes are still not enough, then you can even add a bonus debuff straight up for just destroyers, right? That if destroyers activate their, DFAA, this new revised version, then CV reticles will be harder to tighten up on them. Personally, I'm not sure if that will be needed, but hey, if gameplay experience ends up suggesting, yeah, we do need this, then go for it. And that's really all I have to say today. I'm still really hoping that CV play can get to a point where the CV play and the surface ship play can both be fun and enjoyable, and that the players who have left because of the current gameplay state will come back and actually enjoy the game once again. Anyways, what do you guys all think about these suggestions? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Aside from all that, take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to all of you again next time.